What's up, Goon Squad? Welcome to the 100th episode of the Football Goons podcast. We want to start off by saying right out of the gates here, a great big thank you to everyone who's been listening and watching on our YouTube page live each and every week for over these first 100 episodes. We've really enjoyed, sharing our passion with all of you, our loyal listeners. And we're really looking forward to the next 100 already, and then some. We wanted to do something special to commemorate 100 episodes. That wasn't just like a recycled best of, let's talk about all the stuff we did over the first 100 episodes. So we came up with a cool idea here. It's called the Fantasy Mega Draft. And we're going to get into the details of what all went in or goes into the Fantasy Mega Draft. We think you guys are going to enjoy it. It'll be interactive. You'll be able to vote on who you think drafted the best team. But first, let's take a second here just for, right out of the gates here, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Let's reflect on this milestone because it really shouldn't be taken lightly. 100 episodes of a show. We don't do this multiple times a week. So we didn't get to 100 episodes in like 4 months. This is, a long time coming for us. So I'll ask you guys this. Did you ever imagine hitting 100 episodes, first of all? And how have your feelings changed about podcasting and the live show overall since we started?
I felt that hitting 100 was inevitable for us. I mean, like, we're 4 guys who love doing this. And even from the beginning, we were kind of like, well, even if this just is the 4 of us hanging out every single week and putting it out there, like, we're going to do that together. And we're all in this for the long run. So hitting 100 was never a question. Now, obviously, picking up steam and getting more and more listeners and being at 1,600 likes on Facebook, like those are cool milestones for us. So being that it wound up not being just the 4 of us hanging out for 100 consecutive weeks, that to me is something special. I'm glad every week I tell you guys I'm glad that we're doing this together.
Yeah, I think we all knew that we knew, the 4 of us at least, that we're not the kind of guys to give up on stuff. Like, we'll drive it into the ground even if nobody's joining us. We're like, oh, we're going to keep doing this thing. Thankfully, that's not the case. They're listening to us. So we're glad to be out there. We're glad to be doing it. I feel like I don't say it enough. I couldn't be more thankful it's with you 3 goons. Like, I feel like we just already have this brotherhood that we're doing, and now we're letting other people in on. But yeah, it's just been fun, man. And doing the live shows, we've just had to tighten up. We can't make mistakes. So we just have to, we listen to guys that we make fun of in private, not mentioning any names, that mess up constantly on the radio. And we're doing this for a couple thousand. They're doing it for a couple million. So we're happy to be tightening things up and trying to put out our best product every week.
Yeah. Yeah. That's been the only thing for me, is just knowing how far we've come. With the first couple of months, it was like you'd be in the middle of a speech and I'd be like, all right, hold on. South, make sure you mark down what time we're out, because I messed up. Like, right. I said the quarterback for the Eagles was like Brett Sanchez. It's like, we're still dumb, but there's no more editing, which is fun, I guess. But it's just a good time, man. I'm glad, like you guys said, that it's taken off, at least to some extent. But even if it wasn't, we just get to talk about ball once a week, which is fun.
Yep.
Yeah, I just enjoy really the camaraderie, hanging out, talking about football, just cutting loose. If it's an hour a week that you can kind of be distracted from everything that's going on. Like, I think that we could all admit that, like, we live in a crazy world. So to have a distraction for an hour or 2 a week and just be able to get away from it and hang out and just talk about something that we're all extremely passionate about, we all love, is the coolest part. And, Miles, you hit it on the head. Like, we went from when we started, we'd have like 2.5 hours worth of raw materials
for 40 minutes
for a 40-minute podcast. And it would just be like, we were so worried about every little thing. Like, did I take too much of a break there? Did I laugh too hard? Like, it's just cool to see like how far we've come to where, we're kind of running this thing like a well-oiled machine. And by well-oiled machine, I mean like as squeaky as Rocco's chair for like the first 50 episodes.
We tightened it up.
We tightened it up though. But it's fun. Like, looking at the map of where people are downloading, where people are listening, it's crazy that like
Amazing.
people are listening in Japan, people are listening in like Ireland, the UK, South America. Like we've had listeners and downloads in Africa. Like it's just crazy to think of that 4 Goons are worldwide, and it's cool.
Can I put one more disclaimer out there? Yeah, we get on here every week and we argue and we debate and things get heated once in a while. And at the end of the day, we watch these other shows where they debate, and then at the end you're like, I'm pretty sure they hate each other. Like that's all just raw. Like they hate each other. We get off here and we just talk like normal guys again. Like we just get over it and we're all actually still friends again. So we also have that. It's all real.
Yeah, it's cool because it's not scripted either.
Right.
I think one of my favorite parts is like that we hang out for like an extra hour after we're done.
Right.
And most of that is just straight laughing until we're crying until we're ready to go to bed.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, guys, we appreciate the support to this point. We're not done yet. This thing is really like just starting to take off, even though we're at 100 episodes right now. So we want to keep hearing from you, keep getting that feedback. So feel free to reach out to us. If you're watching live on YouTube right now, you're going to be able to be a part of the show tonight because we're doing our first ever fantasy mega draft. And mega draft might be something that catches on for us. Who knows? We may mega draft like cartoon characters, cereal. Who knows?
I like it.
It may come up from time to time. But what we're doing here is the 4 of us, we're randomly given an order. That order is going to be Deal, South, Miles, and Rocco. And we'll run this as a snake draft, so it'll go in reverse order in the second round. And what we're doing here is we're drafting a team that consists of a quarterback, a running back, wide receiver, tight end. So 6 positions, keeping fantasy football in mind. And we have to do this across the past 6 decades of football. So you're going to have to take one player from the 60s, one from the 70s, one from the 80s, one from the 90s, one from the 2000s, and one from the current 2010s. That's basically the main rule. The only other rule is that to be eligible for a decade, the player you pick had to play 5 seasons in that decade. So I can't take Peyton Manning and say, I'm going to use him as my 90s player and he's my quarterback. That doesn't work. He didn't play enough seasons in the 90s for that to qualify. So those are the 2 rules. We're going to draft this thing out. There may be a little bit of a gap here if a guy goes where we didn't expect and we got to shuffle a little bit, but we're going to do our best to talk about what we're thinking as we're putting the team together, why we made the pick, give you a little bit of background on, some of these older guys. We're going to have to kind of project a little bit about what they would have done fantasy wise, but that's going to be the fun part. And it's going to be up to you, our loyal listeners, to decide who put the best team together. All right, so without further ado, let's get the fantasy mega draft underway here. Ryan Deal, you are on the clock.
I don't think this one's a shocker. At least it shouldn't be. My number 1 pick is going to be a running back, and I'm taking 60s, Jim Brown.
Thought behind that, or are you just going to...
I mean, I think it's obvious. I mean, he's one of the probably 3 or 4. It's debatable, maybe the best ever. And you get him in the 60s where you weren't getting very much out of quarterbacks, you weren't getting very much out of wide receivers, and beyond Jim Brown, like that was pretty much it. So you're getting a 1, 2, or 3 best at his position of all time in an era where you're not getting much else. So it's kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah, I mean, see, now there's an interesting conundrum because this is the thought kind of goes in here. Do you just punt on a decade now because the clear cut, probably best, player of that decade is gone? Or do you go with a different player? So with that in mind, I'm going to take the number 2 pick. I am going to punt on some of these earlier decades, which may come back to hurt me later on. But I am actually going to go ahead and use my 90s pick. Sorry, let me make sure I got this right here. This is the beauty of being live now. And after talking about how we were basically...
We just said we tightened up, man.
Yeah, we tightened up. So, yeah, so look, I'm going to use my... I'm going to use my 80s pick here. All right, I had the wrong category written down. But I'm taking Jerry Rice. All right. Because here's the thing. If you put together, now this is for over the entire body of their careers. And I know he played for a long time, so it helps him in that regard. But from an overall fantasy points per game perspective, from the whole body of their career, you're not getting any better than Jerry Rice. He would be the number one fantasy point scorer of all time. And the reason why I didn't go with a running back is because I feel like there's a couple of running backs who are clumped in close there. And Jerry Rice was just far and away the best at his position, in my opinion, from the fantasy points perspective for anybody. I see some head shaking. We'll get into some of the discussion later.
I'm gonna back you up there, South. I just want the listeners to know. I mean, we've all done our own individual research, but Jerry Rice in the 80s is the number one fantasy wide receiver and if you break it up into a 16-game season for everybody, Jerry Rice would give you the number one output from a wide receiver in the 1980s, and number two on that list is Jerry Rice from the 1990s. Yeah, I went that far and did it. So, I understand where Miles is thinking already with shaking his head, but in terms of the best wide receiver of all time, it's not even a question that it's Jerry Rice.
Yeah, and I'm stupid because I put 1990 as a column twice instead of 1980 and 1990. So that's where I was trying to figure out my mistake. But like I said, we tightened it up. All right, so Miles, you're on the clock.
So you are taking 80s Jerry Rice.
Yes.
AKA the Jerry Rice that caught 15 fewer balls than a year than that. Anyways, all right. I'm thrilled to death because I think there's one no-brainer top overall pick. It is literally the only guy who put up any numbers at any position in the entire 1970s. I'm taking Walter Payton. Sweetness, come on to the team. What I did here for my research is just did a per game basis and then multiplied by 16 for the whole decade. So Walter Payton for me, 1,936 all-purpose yards and 15 touchdowns per season gives him the number 3 production of running back in this entire 60 years. But he is the only player in the 70s that does anything. Deal already took the top scoring running back. I'm going to take number 3 more because I just destroyed all of you in the 70s. Destroyed. So Walter Payton on the team.
All right. So, okay. Never mind. Good. South, am I just going to go, or are you going to leave me in, or I can't wait to destroy Miles's theory here.
I'm just collecting my thoughts here, marking some names off. But Rocco, you are on the clock for 2 straight picks.
All right, sweet. So Miles, he's not the number one running back of all time, and neither is Jim Brown. So the number one running back of all time is the guy that I'm going to take. I'm going to use my 2000s pick, and I'm going to take LaDainian Tomlinson. He actually beats Jim Brown by 4 points per game on a per game average. So I'm going to use my 2000 pick on LT.
That's the thing. I'm going to interrupt. I don't know how we're doing numbers. I don't know how we're doing numbers because I have LT 200 yards per season behind Jim Brown. So
but multiple touchdowns more.
One.
No,
LT has 17 touchdowns a year and Jim Brown has 16.
I don't know if I just averaged up, in terms of
you rounded up by 5.
If it was like
by 200.
No. I have LT at 18 touchdowns per game, rushing, receiving, per season, rushing and receiving. So I don't have Jim Brown at that number even close. So, but
one of us is an algebra teacher, so I don't know.
Yeah. That's fine. I don't know what algebra has to do here, but I have LT as the top,
3 times.
I have LT as the top scoring fantasy running back of all time, regardless of decade. I will agree with you that there's a big drop there, but that's going to be my first round pick, and then obviously in a snake, I get the first pick in the next round.
We always discuss we're not snaking.
we're snaking, or else we're snaking, or I'm cutting you, deal. So
I don't want to cut.
This is actually a really, really hard pick for me, but I think it's the drop off is too great. And when we talk about regular fantasy drafts, we always talk about the drop off in the running back group and how important it is to grab that guy. I think the drop off here is absolutely insane. But you would never usually take this player this high. But I'm going to take my 2010s pick, and I'm going to take Rob Gronkowski, the tight end. I know it's early to have that tight end, but I want to make sure By my numbers, I now have the top 2 players in that group, and the drop off from Gronk to the next tight end is huge. By the way, in case you're wondering, it's like 76 points per fantasy season. So even if any of these 3 goons get the number 2 tight end, I got 76 points up with Gronk.
It's going to be fun after the fact to kind of compare notes, because I mean that one holds a lot of water. But the running back thing, I'm really intrigued to see how your math worked out. Anyhow, that'll go ahead and put me back on the clock. And talk amongst yourselves for about a minute here while I figure out exactly what I want to do.
Yeah, see, this is the beauty of it. Now that there's some names off the board,
I'm gonna be
go
shocked. I'm gonna be shocked. And like, if for our listeners who haven't been with us for a long time or maybe missed this episode, we did something like this last year. I believe it was when we took a 1 per round selected draft. Kind of similar idea, but basically you had to have you can use anybody in the NFL, but we each had to have somebody from one of the 7 rounds. So once you had a first round guy, you couldn't have any more first round guys, and that was a fun thing to do too. And if I remember for that one, I had my whole team picked before we even started. I got every player I wanted. I marked it down. I said, this is going to go one of 2 ways. And I'll let our listeners know I did the same thing today. And I will not be shocked if it happens again, where I get every single guy on this list. And I knew my team before we even started.
I did get one. I had 90s Jerry Rice, which I can't have because I guess we didn't touch on that, South. Once Jerry Rice is gone, he's gone, even though South took him for the 80s.
Yeah, so once a player's gone, he's gone. You can't take like 2000s Tom Brady and 2010s Tom Brady or anything like that. So, when a player is gone by name, he's gone.
All right, I'm set here. This is going to be a little bit of a surprising pick because when you break down kind of who's the best at each position, you have the debates over history as sports fans in general. This guy's name wouldn't really come up, but from a fantasy perspective, again, the way I did my math, extrapolating everybody to 16 game seasons, my second round pick, I'm going running back again here, and I'm going to cover the 1980s, and I'm going to go with Eric Dickerson, who is one of only 2 players, along with Deal's first overall selection of Jim Brown, that projects to 2,000 yards per season for an entire decade. No one else can do that. His 13 touchdowns per season is a little below guys like Emmett and LT, Peyton and Jim Brown, who are already gone. But those are the only guys that he's behind, and he's way ahead in yards. Plus, similar to my first pick thinking with going with the 70s, the 80s, not really an era with a ton of huge numbers. So I feel like I've locked up, honestly, the 2 most difficult running back decades, at least, by going with the 70s and 80s right now. So I'm feeling pretty good with Sweetness and Eric Dickerson in my backfield, understanding I've left some bigger names out there, but this is about numbers, baby, and I'm crushing that.
That's a good pick. I was thinking along, similar lines with running back here. So, I mean, what I wanted to do with this pick, just to kind of give you guys some insight here into what I'm thinking, is I wanted to get a back here who kind of fit the mold of what you just described, who was elite for their decade. So what I'm going to actually go ahead and do here is use my 2000s pick, and I'm going to take Marshall Faulk. Sneaky good pick here, in my opinion, because people kind of forget about Marshall Faulk in the grand scheme of things, because he was a part of like some really electrifying offenses, but this is a guy who was the original PPR threat. So we didn't quite specify, specific scoring. So I'm not going to take credit and say like, oh, I just picked a guy who, is going to average 65 catches a year or whatever. I'm not going to claim that because that would be unfair. But what you can claim is the yardage. I mean, this is a guy that from 2000 all the way up until he was done in 2005, his worst receiving year was 45 catches. He had 290 yards, but he only through the air, but he only played 11 games that season. This is a guy who was consistent scoring the ball as well. He did it through the air, on the ground. We're talking about 100 scores combined through the 2000s. So it's a guy who kind of does it all, jack of all trades. I know he doesn't project to as many yards rushing necessarily as some guys, but the combined yardage from 2000 through 2005, you're looking at a guy who was a lock for 1,500 to 1,600 yards every single season, double-digit touchdowns. So I feel really good about that pick right there.
Yeah, you don't have to convince me. He's my pick as the greatest running back of all time. When you fantasy wise, maybe not, but just in general, I love hearing people talk about Marshall Faulk because you want to talk about today's NFL with just a complete player, man. He's one of the best pass blocking backs of all time. Kurt Warren will tell you that. So you combine that with the fact that he was probably a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL during his heyday, especially with the Rams. But, people ignore his production with the Colts as well. I actually personally think 90s Faulk is a little better of a player, but I'm not going to knock you for taking 2000s Faulk. The guy just did everything at an elite level. Not could do everything. He did it all at an elite level, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think that he kind of kicked it into an elite gear in the 2000s, which is why I went that direction because – he was great in the passing game in the 90s, but he really went to just another level. So
yeah,
that's why.
I think especially starting 99, because that caliber player, you're going to take getting traded pretty personally.
Right. Well, not just that, but
why are you trading me?
He was everything on the Colts, and then he didn't have to be everything. So it's like when you gotta worry about Warner and Torrey Holt and Isaac Bruce and Isaac Hakeem, those names scare you, and now you can't focus on Marshall Faulk all the time. And then that's when he had his MVP season. You know what I mean? So it's easy to forget about that.
Right. All right, so Deal, you're on the clock here. Back-to-back picks.
My back-to-back, I think it's not going to be a big shock. I'm going to go ahead and take a running back because I'm going to do this like fantasy, and it's exactly what I would do.
I'm going to take another one after this, though, man. That's scary.
I can't. We're not doing flex for a third?
No.
Oh, man. I'm going to have to rethink it when we get deeper here. No, I'm going to go. Miles, you talked a lot about sweetness in the 70s. He was my number one running back, but I got 1A and 1B. I got the guy that's led the decade 4 times in rushing, the first guy ever to rush for 2,000 yards in a season. O.J. Simpson is my number 2 running back. I feel like I'm not really hurting by having Jim Brown and O.J. Simpson and then just go ahead and cancel out the 70s and 60s. So I feel pretty good about that. And then for my next pick, I'm going to take I'm going to go to the 80s. I'm going to get Dan Marino. And I'm going to get a guy that was putting up numbers that we're seeing today for the first time about 40 years ago. So numbers that we're seeing today and then we didn't see for another 35 years. Dan Marino was doing it back in the 80s. He was putting up a record that didn't get broken until the 2000s by Peyton in touchdowns. So this guy was doing it. And when you go down the list and see basically all the other quarterbacks, especially in the 60s and 70s, you see guys that were putting up like 2,000 yards and 6 touchdowns. So I'm getting a guy that's putting up 5,000 yards and 40 touchdowns per season. So I'm getting Drew Brees numbers back in the 80s. So I feel great about that.
I have 3 comments. First off, I really didn't appreciate that you said the 80s was like 40 years ago because that makes me like 40. So I didn't like that.
We're getting close, man. We're getting close.
I didn't like that even some. Secondly, I've been playing fantasy football with you since 2008. And this is, I would be very willing to bet this is the first draft I've ever seen you break the quarterback cherry there. So you're the first one to take quarterback. True. It's never happened. Yeah. And lastly, you have Jim Brown, O.J. Simpson, and Dan Marino. Your team's acting chops is phenomenal.
Yeah,
you're all over the movie scene.
Yep,
with those 3 guys. Way to go, man! Hollywood loves your squad.
Thank you.
Yeah, listen, I'm on the clock here. I'm bumming a little bit because I was kind of hoping that OJ would swing back around here. It didn't happen for me, obviously. So punting early kind of comes back to hurt a little bit there. I do have an alternate plan for those decades. So I'm going to go a little more recently here. And Deal kind of beat me to the punch here with the quarterback. But I'm taking a guy that, to me, in the 2010 decade here, is kind of a no-brainer when we're talking about quarterbacks. I'm going with Drew Brees. Like, look, here's a guy who every single season is going to throw for the most yards over the course of the 2010s. If he didn't, he threw for what, 4,900 instead of 5,000 because, Peyton had a ridiculous year. He throws for a ton of touchdowns except for last year because I finally owned him. So, but he doesn't turn the ball over a lot. He's just the most prolific quarterback, whole body of work over the 2010s for me. You got Aaron Rodgers, but there's been some up and downs with some injury there. Tom Brady, like, he's been the absolute best on the field, but the numbers don't jump off the page at you all the time. So to me, it's Drew Brees.
So can I just say, I know we got different strategies, but for two of your players, I've had to write them onto my board.
Wow, Drew Brees he's my number one.
Drew Brees is the number one quarterback of all time. Like, I understand. Like, you may not want to use your 2010s pick on a quarterback, so I can understand not having him there.
A quarterback not named Aaron Rodgers.
Well, you know what, though? It's kind of funny, and I'll share with you guys. Like Miles said, maybe we may have done our stuff a little different here in terms of that. But my 1-2 of all time, in terms of a fantasy points per season scorer, Drew Brees is 1 and Aaron Rodgers is 2 in the 2010s. So right. Brees is higher. He's the yardage difference there is huge. Actually, Rodgers averages 2 more touchdowns per season, but like 400 less yards per season. So,
all right,
Miles, you are on the clock.
Yep. I am going to go ahead and use my 2010s pick here as well, which was not intended on being my 2010s pick because that was going to be Drew Brees. Thanks a lot.
Sorry.
I'm going to go ahead and take Antonio Brown as one of my wide receivers. When you put him into a 16-game season, he averages 111 catches, 1,496 yards, and 9 touchdowns receiving. I know, again, we didn't call this the settings and the scoring standards and everything like that, but any PPR, he's the only one over 100 catches per season. And he's got 111. His touchdown numbers are a little low, but I think what I'm banking on with this 2010s pick is that Antonio Brown is not slowing down for me. So I understand I'm getting 3 more years of monstrous production, and the touchdowns are more coming the last 3 or 4 years versus what he did in 2010 and 2011, even 2012. So I'm going to take my 2010s pick. I'm going to go with Antonio Brown. I'm feeling really good about the pure yardage production that I've got out of my 3 picks so far.
All right, Rocco, you are on the clock here for back-to-back.
I had to write in AB too.
All right.
No, I'm just kidding.
Hey, listen, we all look at things differently, but that would be ridiculous.
I'll be honest. I didn't put AB on my list, not because he's not up there, but because I kind of knew where I wanted to go. And this is all different how we plan things, which is kind of fun about this exercise. I didn't include AB because I knew I wasn't going to use my 2010s pick on a wide receiver. Like, I knew very early on that I wanted that huge discrepancy at tight end, to make up for the fact. And there were lots of guys that absolutely should be on our lists that I didn't include, and I didn't bother doing research on because I knew I wasn't going to go in that direction. So, but obviously AB should be on everybody's list. Deal, I'm shocked by your 80s pick of Dan Marino. I never in a million years thought you would have done that. That would have been my pick here. I thought I was clear-cut the only one that was going to use that pick. It's not a guy that this group talks about a lot, so I thought I was pretty safe there. So I did have to adjust my strategy here. Right now, I'm going to use my 90s pick, and I'm going to grab my second favorite running back of all time, and a guy that I think is absolutely incredible on every level. I would love to see what this guy would have done on a real NFL team and not the Detroit Lions of the 1990s. And I'm going to go with Barry Sanders. Obviously, there's not a lot of things I need to say about that pick.
I think the most fun part of any Barry Sanders debate is like what else could have happened. And I firmly believe the answer is more. Like, I'm not saying, but I mean, you look at the guy's numbers and it's like, good Lord, what would have honestly happened if you were on, and people always say, what if you traded Barry for Emmett? Well, I don't even go that far. Like, put him on an average team and see what could have happened. The guy had Scott Mitchell as his quarterback. Horrible lines, running the run and shoot, never had a fullback. I mean, it's insane to think of the numbers he could have put up if he was even on a competent team with a competent coach.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm going to jump into my next pick right here. This has been kind of a dark horse pick for me this entire time. I can definitely catch some crap for this, but I think it's actually kind of an out of left field pick. It is a Hall of Famer, but it's not a guy that would ever be brought up for discussion in a best of all time scenario. But I'm going to use my 1960s pick on Jets wide receiver Don Maynard. All right. My thought process here, real simple, is based on the way the Jets were throwing the ball back then and not a lot of the league was, Maynard has some actually pretty amazing numbers on a per game fantasy basis. And I'll be honest, I did kind of go with the half point PPR mentality just because most regular leagues right now are swinging towards that. So even if you don't go with that, back then catches didn't really matter enough. So what you're really getting with Maynard is the yards. In the 1960s, he averaged 1,200 yards a season if it was stretched out to a 16-game season with 10 touchdowns. You're not getting that production from another 1960s wide receiver. Right. And then on top of that, I took some fun liberties here, and I took Joe Namath's and all the other Jets quarterbacks from the 1960s. I took their per game pass attempt numbers and then, compared that to not even the top pass attempts of today, but I took basically the NFL average. And there's quite a discrepancy there. It's about 50% more passes attempts per game. So even if you take that and then obviously look at Joe Namath as a career 50% passer and only give him a 25% bump or even a 15% bump. Don Maynard's giving you, top 10 regular and any season top 10 fantasy production. So he's already got a ridiculously high number for the 1960s. If you stretch it out to a 16-game season. And then, like I said, I did take a little bit of a liberty and say, okay, could you imagine what would happen if he was playing in today's offense where they're throwing the ball 50% more time or 45% more time than they were back in the 1960s? So that's going to be my fourth round pick. First pick of the fourth round is Don Maynard.
All right. I know you're a Jets fan, and that's good. But you could have gone with a 1960s wide receiver that again projected to 16 games a season, averaged 1,481 yards and 13 touchdowns a season, which would be the Chargers' Lance Allworth, also a Hall of Famer, far better numbers than your boy, which we all got to like our team. I get it. I guess
it's not even a matter of
I should have taken Tommy McDonald, even though he had 500 yards per year less than Lance Allworth, also a Hall of Famer, by the way. But no, I'm going to go ahead and take the 60s. This was kind of my sneaky 60s pick since I, would have bet my life on not getting Jim Brown at number 3 overall. I would go ahead and figure this was going to be my 60s pick. So at wide receiver to pair with Antonio Brown, I'm going to go with Lance Allworth, separated by 50 years, but only 15 yards per season. Lance Allworth was doing it back when no one else was doing it, including Don Maynard.
All right. Well, look, this puts me in a good position, almost not necessarily good because there's not a lot left in the 1960s that's particularly great, but because everybody else took a player in that decade now, I don't have to worry about that. So I can jump back, maybe a little more recently, not to make any of us feel old here, but I could jump more recently and take one of these players. And to me, there's one that kind of jumps off the page at me here who's available in the 1990s. This is going to hurt so bad to do this. But we're talking about a guy who averaged literally a fraction of a point away from 92 yards per game all through the decade rushing. He was more than suitable in the passing game. He averaged a fraction under 1 touchdown per game when you combine what he did on the ground and through the air. I'm going with Emmitt Smith as my 1990s pick. He's a guy who didn't miss really any time. There were some times that he played 15 games or whatever. Probably didn't have to play the last week of the season. At that point, it was a team that was just kind of rolling. Might have been nicked up here and there. Other than the 93 season, he was just super durable all around. You knew he was going to run for 100 yards. You knew he was going to get in the end zone. And you knew it was going to be against the Eagles so that you could be miserable and have to go to school at Dana Street Elementary the next day, and all your buddies in their stained Cowboy starter jackets were going to harass you as soon as you walked in the front door. And I was going to say, "Oh, hey, what part of Texas are you from, knucklehead?"
Because that's literally all you can say in the 90s as an Eagles fan versus the Cowboys.
That was it. That was it. So, Deal, you're on the clock now that I sold my soul.
Not only did you sell your soul, it's a weird pick because if you look at mine, I have 2 running backs already. So you could have had any wide receiver you wanted from the 2000s, but you punted on that. So maybe not the best strategy, but you're also I'll cut you a break because you are hosting this thing and having to focus on a lot of things.
I had already picked the 2000s player, so.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. You're right. So that was my fault. I was actually looking in Miles' category there.
Hey, okay. This is live. Tighten up. Let's go,
dude. I'm all over the place here. No, I feel great about this. I'm gonna go back to back on wide receivers, and I'm just gonna get like 2 years worth of 1,000 receptions. Like that's just 2 guys. Yeah. I'm going to take Chris Carter, who was unbelievable. He had 2 years in a row of 122 receptions, and then he dropped off the map with 96 the next year, but 1,163 yards. Chris Carter is a no-brainer. I mean, I'm happy for you guys to fight for second place, but nothing there, huh? Crickets. That's okay. I don't mind. The next one, I'm going to get a guy that, he laughed at the 122 receptions and got 143. Marvin Harrison, one of my favorite players of all time. I'm going to load up with guys that could possibly killed people. I don't know. It's just allegations, but I'm going to go ahead and tighten out my wide receivers here with Marvin Harrison.
Yeah, you might get a couple catches.
A couple between 122 and 143. I'll take somewhere in between there even. Just average them out. I'll take it.
All right, so this is going to put me in the enviable task of having to pick from probably the 2 least desirable decades now for 2 of the least desirable positions, in an era where like they weren't exactly chucking the ball around all that much. So I'm kind of going to go out of left field here and go with 1970s pick. I'm going to take Dave Casper as my tight end here. This is a sneaky pick because you don't typically think about a lot of guys from the 70s and earlier. And Rocco kind of touched on this before. There were only a couple teams that were really slinging it around at that point. And the Raiders happened to be one of them. And Casper was really productive. I mean, he was kind of given the title of tight end, but I mean, he played a little bit of everything in that offense. So he was extremely productive. When you put all of the fantasy points together for tight ends over their entire body of work, he's a top 10 tight end all time in projected fantasy scoring. He's a guy who is about 420 points ahead of the average person at the tight end position. Now it figures in a lot of people. So, I'm kind of using that to my advantage, but nonetheless, that's still quite a few points there. And to be in the top 10 in a group with a lot of guys and to be able to get a guy like that who was very productive through the 70s, I'm going to take it at this point. So I'm going to go with Dave Casper.
Yeah, there were a couple guys that were kind of hidden gems at the tight end position, especially if you allowed yourself to project. Not so much, we talked about earlier in the week, like, hey, can I say how good Dave Casper would have been in 2005? And we said, no, not really. You can make the argument, but it's hard. But if you just put their per game averages to 16 games, there are guys like him, Kellen Winslow. I mean, a couple guys that sneakily would have put up really good 16 game numbers. So not a bad pick at all.
Yeah, and I had a projection here, but my, just full transparency, my Excel is frozen and just spinning right now, so I can't click over to that tab to tell you. But I might save it for the afterwards here to argue my point further.
Right.
All right, Miles, you are back on the clock.
Yeah, so I'm here. I've got 2 positions left. I've got to take my quarterback and my tight end, and I've got the 90s and the 2000s to go. And there's quite a few combinations that I'm kind of considering here. Now, I do, hey, I like to take anything I can and try to give people suggestions for real fantasy. And what Deal said to you is exactly what I did, where he said you could have waited on running back because he had already taken his. I was all set to grab quarterback there in round 4, but then I looked at both of you guys already have your quarterback. So while I doubt either of you were going to take Lance Allworth, it was also a situation where you couldn't have taken Lance Allworth because you both had your 60s guy, no, South you didn't. Anyways,
nope.
My point
was he was on my radar.
My point was I better grab him just in case, and because you can't take my quarterback. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do it again on the other side, knowing that Rocco already has Gronk. There's no need for me to take a tight end here because he can't. So the combination I'm going to end up going with, I'm going to use my 2000s pick on the quarterback here, and I'm going with Peyton Manning from the Colts in the 2000s. Absolutely ridiculous. All those numbers that Deal said that Marvin Harrison put up as a receiver. Well, Peyton Manning was throwing him the ball, and we didn't count all the crazy numbers Reggie Wayne had, or the crazy numbers that Dallas Clark had, or the crazy numbers that Edgerrin James had through the air. So, there's 3 guys here in the 2000s, Peyton or Tom Brady. Drew Brees would have been a consideration if he wasn't already sucked up from the 2010s. 2010 Tom Brady, awesome. A lot better than 2000s Tom Brady as far as numbers. So I went ahead with the solid, full, awesome decade of the Colt Peyton Manning to be at the helm of my team here.
All right, Rocco, that puts you on the clock back to back.
All righty. My last 2 picks here. I'll start off with my 1980s pick, which is going to be a wide receiver. Obviously, Jerry Rice, the most desirable wide receiver of that time period. But I feel like this guy is also a good pick, another Hall of Famer. Not the most flashy guy in the world, but definitely a guy who was consistent. Other than the strike shortened season of 1982, got you at least 60 catches every year in the decade, except for one in which he was injured. He came in with 1,000 yards receiving 5 times throughout the decade, also at a time where people were not throwing the ball all that often. But I'm going to take James Lofton. All right.
Wow.
Shocking.
Well, I'm not going to dispute how good James Lofton was. Personally, I still have 2 80s wide receivers ranked ahead of him. And I
think it's fair. I mean, there was 3 other 80s wide receivers that I had done numbers on, and Lofton, I think, gives you the most consistency. I think a lot of the other guys, although like a guy like Steve Largent, the receptions are there, the yardage was not there a lot, and the touchdowns were kind of hit or miss for me. Almost every year with Lofton, you're 8, 7, 8, 5, 7, 8. Like you're going to get the scores from him, So that was kind of my feeling there. And I just, like I said, there were a couple other guys. Art Monk's another great guy, had a bunch of good years, but he had some really down years in terms of yardage in the 80s as well. So
and that's kind of where the way I crunch my numbers is cheating to an extent, because like my pick absolutely would have been Art Monk, because again, I did here's your numbers divided by your games times 16. So it sort of ignored his injury risk, which I did for this entire draft. So I just wanted the guy purely that was the best player.
See, and I did that a lot too, but then I also decided to take into consideration, Art Monk missed time here. Steve Largent doesn't have the yards really per game, So
it's kind of
just the way I went with it.
It's kind of the fun part of South making this up and not really setting rules. It's like
absolutely.
How did you want to go about it? And it kind of made it a little more fun to know. I don't want Art Monk getting crushed by his injury history.
Yeah, and look, too, like, even when people vote on this, like they're going to be subjective in voting, because like people are going to look at certain players and be like, oh man, they crushed it. So like it's really hard to weigh like how people are going to judge your team. So I think leaving it a little bit open for stuff like that makes it a little more fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to end this, I'm going to be honest. I kind of left this guy for last, and this was my backup scenario because, like I said, I did think I was going to wind up with Dan Marino. I did not. Luckily, I did not have to scramble here. But it's not necessarily the most traditional pick. But in the 1970s, I'm going to take a guy who you would not, think of necessarily, but because he was kind of the first guy to give you the rushing stats too, which obviously have to count if we're talking about a fantasy season. I'm going to go with Fran Tarkenton. I think he was better in the 60s and the 70s, but still super productive in the 1970s in terms of throwing the ball, in terms of still giving you the rushing yards and the touchdowns on the ground. And then at a time where, not necessarily the quarterback was always doing that. So again, I took the ability to then project that out over a 16-game season instead of a 14-game. And like I said, I did give certain guys a bump to try and make it more realistic. And Fran Tarkenton still gives you, in today's NFL, in a 16-game season, the way I factored it out, he would still give you top 10 production all time in terms of points per game per season. So Fran Tarkenton is my 1970s quarterback.
I'm going to kind of laugh that it ended up going that way because the whole week when I was looking at this stuff, I said, man, the last thing I want is to get stuck with a 70s quarterback. Like I have 15 quarterbacks like listed out that I'm willing to draft, and I do not have the 1970s represented on that list. So
yeah, I said, I had to take the liabilities.
You made the best choice you could.
Well, not only that, but and I'll be fair when I say this, I took some personal, choices to decide to say, okay, well, Fran Tarkenton averaged, 350 attempts per season. The NFL average in 2017, the mean is like 491.
Right.
So what can I do with an extra 140 passes, right, and then conservatively he's a 60% completion percentage guy throughout his career. So I give him a 30% bump or whatever it is, of his points per game. And yeah, he winds up being top 10 all time. So I'm okay with that. I can live with that.
All right, Miles, that puts you on the clock for your last pick.
Yeah, I'm not sad at all about how this wound down for me. 1990s tight end is what I had to go with. Not exactly a flush decade with tight ends, but I'm really pumped to grab Shannon Sharpe onto this team. For the Broncos, he was excellent during the decade. He made 7 consecutive Pro Bowls. He was the AP #1 tight end 4 times in the decade, 3,000-yard seasons, and one that was a 995. So I'm going to go ahead and give it to him because it helps my pick. A couple times, three times over 9 touchdowns. Just an absolute weapon for the Broncos as they grew as a team and then eventually became back-to-back Super Bowl champions. People are going to point rightfully so to John Elway and Terrell Davis, but Sharpe was just as big a part of that run as anybody. And as far as I'm concerned, extrapolating his numbers out, 1,005 yards per year actually puts him third among tight ends since the 1960s. So no, it's not Gronk like Rocco said earlier, but kind of a fundamental thing for me, and I know the group as a whole, you don't take tight end early because while Gronk's a lot better than Shannon Sharpe, I got Peyton Manning instead of Fran Tarkenton. You know what I mean? Like I got, and I'm not trying to crush your team, but it's the same reason none of the 4 of us ever own Rob Gronkowski. Like he is better than every other tight end, but I'm going to load up on other positions where you're going to be searching and scrambling later. Especially in a real draft, not so much a situation where you kind of get to take one of the 4 best quarterbacks of all time in a sense, but because of the way your team was built, you couldn't do that. I mean, you're talking about Dan Marino, Drew Brees, and Peyton Manning, Yeah. So anyway, all that is to say, Shannon Sharpe, not sad about it.
All right, so I'm gonna kind of get right to the point here with my pick. I only could take a wide receiver from the 60s. I had one guy highlighted, basically, other than Lance Allworth if I couldn't get him in this time frame. That's Charlie Taylor, played for the Redskins. Look, he was a dual threat guy. Like he was listed as a wide receiver, but here's a guy who ran the ball a lot too. If you ever watch, some of the documentaries, like the documentary with, the Redskins from the 60s after Vince Lombardi came over and took things over, he was kind of like the original, like off the field trouble guy of the NFL. So, some of his production eventually stalled out, but this is a guy who all he did, if you take his numbers and throw them into a 16-game season, he would have averaged 740 yards per season receiving, which isn't super great by any means. But then you add an additional 260 rush yards per season. So you're putting a guy literally right at 1,000 yards per season in the 60s, and then averaged 8 touchdowns per 16 games in that limited time in the decade, and then another 2 rushing in the decade. So 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns during a time when football was still coming out of like the really vanilla phase. I'll take that production for my last pick and hope that you guys Google it.
All right, my last pick here. Yeah, I had actually wholeheartedly planned on getting Tony Gonzalez of the 2000s because I thought there's no way I'm going to get either Marvin Harrison or Randy Moss. Then it turned out I had my choice of either, which I didn't mind that. And then so I moved up to the 2010s. I thought I was actually going to get Aaron Rodgers there, and I thought I was going to have to take. I thought I was planning on taking Dickerson in the 80s. So things got shaken up, but I actually like how they got shaken up. So my 2010 tight end pick is Jimmy Graham. Now he's about 2.5 points per season behind Rob Gronkowski, but I think I upgraded enough at the other positions. Again, not making fun of Rocco's team. It's hard picking at the end there, but I got Chris Carter and Marvin Harrison over Don Maynard and James Lofton. So that 2 points for Jimmy Graham off of Gronkowski in a position I don't even care about. I'm not minding that. So I like rounding it out. He's kind of a forgotten gem. We'll throw this out there too. Still don't forget about Jimmy Graham. He's still a really good tight end.
All right, listen, we're going to talk about these teams in a second, but we're going to talk about our friends at Gorb first. All right. Our friends at Gorb, you've heard us talk about this extensively. In life, they tell us that you've only got 2 choices. You could either get hungry or you could be hungry. And you notice if you're watching live on YouTube right now, got some handsome guys here, Deal, Rocco, they're repping the Gorb wear, and they're looking pretty good doing it. Thank you. What I think they like probably the most out of it is not just the fact that it feels great, not just the fact that it looks good, not the fact that there's a ton of different designs, colors, layouts, all kinds of stuff, but it gives them a constant reminder that in life you have those 2 choices. You could either get hungry or you can be hungry. And that's all about finding out what fuels you, what you're passionate about, what your dreams are, and just going after them 100%. Don't just sit back and watch as everybody else pursues their dreams, their goals, and wish that you would have done it and just be hungry, but get after it. If you check them out at GHORBH.com, Gorb.com, you can find something for men, women, kids, accessories, all kinds of stuff. I'm pretty sure you can probably at this point get your dog in something. All right. So they've got all kinds of styles, all selection, different hoodies, t-shirts, all kinds of stuff. You've got to check it out. If you don't find something that you like there, I don't think we could be friends because there's a lot of great stuff. All right. Check them out today. Gorb.com, GHORBH.com.
South, can I throw an advertisement out there real quick?
Yeah, you can.
In effort of our 100th episode here, and we're so close to 1,600 follows on Facebook or likes on Facebook, I'm going to see if I could talk our sponsors at Gorb into giving away a free shirt if we can get the 1,600 views or 1,600 likes on Facebook in the next week. I'll give out a free shirt.
I like the idea. Definitely do it. If you like the page this week, I'm assuming you're going to automatically enter them into a drawing.
Yep.
And also, we're going to pull some names randomly and pick you if you like the page starting this week, if you've done it over the last couple days. For those of you that have seen the post, we do have some of our original limited edition Football Goons t-shirts that we could still send out to you. So we're going to pick a bunch of names and just start sending some stuff out as a thank you for 100 episodes. All right, let's break this down real quickly here. We just want to take the next couple minutes here, 10 minutes or so, and talk about how we approached the fantasy mega draft, how things changed as we were going along, who we want to make fun of, however we want to approach this. But we're going to just break it down here. So what was your initial strategy to build your team when you head into this thing?
I wanted Walter Payton so bad. I mean that's
pretty good pick.
that was really like, again, with the full knowledge that I was not getting Jim Brown. For me, when you're looking at a 6-player draft, you can't have a pick or even two that stick out like a sore thumb. Like in this situation, we're going to throw this out to the public, and not everybody studies football like crazy. So I'm going to guarantee Deal's going to win this vote because everybody's heard of Jim Brown. Like you can talk till you're red in the face about how good Dave Casper and Charlie Taylor are, and you're right. And I can talk about Lance Allworth, and Rock can talk about Don Maynard and Fran Tarkenton. But the key is to get those players from forever ago that are still legends, like Jim Brown, like Walter Payton. So knowing that I wasn't getting Jim Brown, even that, I looked around at the 60s and like Mike Ditka would have been just fine if he was my tight end from the 60s. I could have lived with that for sure. Even a guy like Gale Sayers in a short career put up awesome numbers. He was really good. So for me, it was kind of, I was unwilling to totally punt. So I really wanted to grab a 60s or 70s star early. And I was really hoping the first two picks weren't Jim Brown or Walter Payton, pretty much leaving you out of that.
Yeah, I kind of thought about that with the name recognition, obviously. But then I don't know, maybe it's just the stubbornness in me. Like I just look at the way that, some of the running backs overall, like they have very similar numbers at the end of the day. Like not necessarily that they're not all great and legendary, but Jerry Rice is just set apart from every other wide receiver. So I kind of wanted to make sure that once I didn't get like Jim Brown, I could circle back. I would have given some consideration to Gale Sayers or guys like that, depending on how things shook out here. But I wanted to make sure that I got far and away the best player at the position there with my first pick. So that was kind of my thought process. And then, I had guys that I had pegged that obviously went before I could take them. I loved the Eric Dickerson pick. I probably would have tried to scoop that up as quick as I could, but it just didn't work out to get back there. So that was kind of my thought process. My first pick, I wanted to take a guy who was far and away the best at his position.
I found it really interesting too. Just, I know this isn't really what your question was, but I'm going to answer it anyways. Like Tom Brady, Randy Moss, Terrell Owens, not drafted at all. Antonio Gates, Tony G, Adrian Peterson, Marcus Allen put up insane numbers. I mean, some of the guys that weren't taken, and I don't say that pointing fingers at any of us that you should have. It's just funny to think of, boy, when you really break down, when you break down a career numbers, we didn't take the number 2 and 3 receivers of all time in T.O. and Randy Moss for one reason or another, but it's just fun to look at the board and be like, who would have thought we'd have a 24-player all-time draft and no one's taken, 8 receivers go and neither of them is Randy or T.O.
Yeah. It's kind of fun. Like obviously, like Moss said, I agree that if you just look at the names on the paper, there's no reason why Deal shouldn't win in terms of the names. But I think it's interesting that like if you actually sat down and did the math and do it out, I think all 4 of these teams are so extremely close. Like even when you factor in like the fact that I have Fran Tarkenton and he has Peyton Manning, well, the way I did it, they're only like 5 points difference. You know what I mean? Like when you consider, the things that I considered, obviously if you just show straight numbers, that's not really fair to compare though, because the NFL is not the same game from the 1960s to the 2000s,
Right.
So, but that's part of what makes this fun is, like I said, I took certain ideas and concepts and put them into practice to see what would be my best scenario,
from Rich on YouTube, was just saying, what about Joe Montana? Like, there's another name that, by all accounts, probably more so the rules of the game dictated that he didn't get taken. But
yeah, just fantasy. It was so fantasy focused that Montana's greatness was never his numbers.
Yeah.
He put up solid number. I'm not, he wasn't some trash can either, but like, again, I did 15 and he wasn't on my list.
Yeah.
I had Warren Moon in the 90s, Steve Young, guys like that. But it's just, again, it's a weird thing because of how numbers oriented it was. You're definitely leaving guys like Joe Montana off, as much as he needs to be in the conversation as the greatest quarterback of all time, or at least did until Tom Brady made like his 19th Super Bowl. But I mean, his greatness was never in fantasy,
Yeah, and that's what makes this fun. If we were doing a draft the best team possible to go out there and win a game on Sunday, then Montana is going to be your 80s quarterback over Dan Marino because he beat him a ton of times.
Right.
But if you're just talking about trying to put together the best fantasy numbers you can, then Montana's not irrelevant, but not in this top group.
Well, this leads me to my next question here. Like, looking at how everything unfolded, what do you wish that you might have done differently during the draft here?
Judge the three of you differently. Like, obviously that's like, it's easy to say like, oh, I wish I would have taken my guy earlier, but like I said, I'm actually sitting here shocked that I didn't wind up with Dan Marino. I never thought in a million years that would be Deal's guy. Knowing that he's a running back guy, I would have thought, Marcus Allen is another guy I'm surprised isn't gone, because there's a guy from the 1980s that was doing things that a lot of other guys weren't doing. So it's a really fun pick if you factor in receiving numbers and receiving touchdowns and catches. Marcus Allen is probably the second best running back of the 80s after Eric Dickerson, which, so it's kind of crazy, when you really look at things like that. Like, I didn't think there was any way that Deal would not go 80s running back. That was just the way I looked at it. I didn't think Miles would go 60s wide receiver. So I thought Don Maynard looks like a slouch in comparison to Lance Allworth, but I didn't think that anybody else was going to have to use a 60 wide receiver.
But
Lance
why
Allworth.
would you? But again, like, this isn't a podcast style, but this is the same old Rock getting cute. Like, yes, he pales in comparison to Lance Allworth. So why would you not take Lance Allworth? Irrelevant to how I would draft.
Well, actually, and this kind of goes into the way I was doing things too. Again, I took certain steps that other people didn't take. Maynard has better numbers when Lance Allworth when you compare it to today's NFL, because they're attempting less passes, so he doesn't get the bump in numbers that I gave, because I played it out for both players. So Allworth's numbers are better than Maynard's, but with far more attempts, far more receptions. So when you actually compare it to today's NFL, he doesn't get the same bump.
But what's the point of fantasy? Like, you're not going to draft Tyreek Hill over Antonio Brown because the Steelers target Antonio Brown more. The point is numbers. That's the point.
But we're not talking about the same deck. Like, we're not talking about two players that are both playing today. I was trying to make all things equal as of today's NFL, essentially. You know what I mean? Like, I tried to make it so that every player on the same level playing field, what do their numbers look like? So yes, Allworth had better numbers in the 60s, but on many more targets, many more receptions, and a lot more opportunities. Now, if you make those opportunities equal, Maynard's per game numbers look better than Allworth's.
So says you, hypothetically.
Well,
what if the Jets? Are a run first team in 2018 too?
Am I not allowed to make this hypothetical?
No.
Wasn't that part of the exercise?
So I'll talk about mine for a second because it's nothing to do with that. But back to what you said about Marcus Allen, he's actually a guy that I planned on getting, but I was going to get him if Jerry Rice and Eric Dickerson went. But I kind of planned on hoping to get Walter Payton or OJ Simpson, because the drop off, then I have Franco Harris on my list, but he's far below those two to me. And then also to go to those three, the drop to Cliff Branch is monumental,
Yeah.
where the drop from Dan Marino or Eric Dickerson, Jerry Rice to Marcus Allen, I'm like, I'll take any of those guys. I don't want Cliff Branch on my team, man, when I can have Chris Carter, Marvin Harrison, Randy Moss, or T.O. So that's why I ended up with Dan Marino, because essentially, like you said, when I mocked it out, it didn't really land this way, but I was happy it did, but that I got, Dan Marino and OJ Simpson instead of Cliff Branch and Marcus Allen. So that's a pretty big upgrade there.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like the thing that I wish probably would have maybe went a little different. I think I probably would have jumped at a 60s or 70s guy a little bit earlier. I think early on, what I wanted to do was take these guys who were clear cut, the best of a decade. Try and have some name brand recognition. One of the big reasons, just quite candidly, why I took Drew Brees is because he's relevant still. So there's recency bias with that. People are going to look at him versus Marino or him versus other quarterbacks and think, man, like Drew Brees just throws a ton of yards. They're not going to take into account that he's got 10 more attempts a game or all that other stuff. So, try to sneak in some brownie points there with the voters, but it may end up hurting me, but I like the beginning of the draft. I just wish that I would have perhaps incorporated one of those decades earlier. So, all right, let's ask this question here. What was the most head scratching thing that happened in your opinion during this?
I want to say the Jerry Rice pick, but it's not so much head scratching because it's like, why did you do that? It's more that I'm very, very surprised that Brown and Peyton didn't go 1-2 just because of what you get versus their decade contemporaries versus, Jerry Rice is amazing. Whether you took 90s Rice or 80s Rice, I'm still more than satisfied with my 80s player of Eric Dickerson versus your Jerry Rice when you compare the fact that then I have Walter Payton instead of Dave Casper, or Deal, he's not sad about having Dan Marino. So I think it's less that I'm surprised you took Jerry Rice because no one's ever been surprised when anyone's taken Jerry Rice for anything, but it's more the fact that you felt the need to take an 80s player second overall when that was really when the NFL started to become a little bit bigger with the numbers. Again, for me, looking around in the 70s, I was like, good God, I don't want anyone other than Walter Payton. And there were other good options, but it was like, he's so much better than everybody else that played in the 70s.
Yeah, I get that. I think I probably just kind of assumed that I was going to get a crack at OJ later on,
right?
Which is so weird to say out loud.
But you still didn't take it, though.
But I didn't take it. But, no, and you know what? I didn't think that. I thought people would probably get a running back early, which happened.
Right.
You had both of your running backs.
Yep.
I figured Deal was going to go with a running back, but I thought that he would go a little more recent.
Yeah.
So I thought, all right, I'll be able to, sneak an OJ Simpson pick in here, and I could be more than happy with that. And I kind of took for granted that, Deal's strategy was basically get two of the best players from those early decades and get it over with.
Yep.
So you don't have to think about it anymore. So which,
right.
In hindsight was good, but like, I just felt like I'd be able to sneak Jerry in there, obviously, get Marshall Faulk, and then hopefully on the way back around, grab OJ Simpson. It didn't work out for me. So keep that in mind, but also trying to get more brownie points. Jerry Rice follows us on Twitter. So Jerry,
that's true.
When you listen, or if you're watching right now, hit me up. We'll talk. We're buddies. So
what are you going to talk about with Jerry Rice?
Why you goons passed him up as the best?
I think you should
second overall.
Maybe we'll go golfing.
I didn't pass him up.
Maybe we'll go golfing together.
All right, I'll give you that.
All right, so yeah, I do suck at golf. I know what you're going to say there. You give me some tips though. So, all right, listen, we're going to wrap it up here, but here's the last question here. I think we kind of all hinted at it, but who do you guys think that the listeners are going to pick as the best team?
I definitely, and it's funny because even ignoring the name recognition, I agree with them. I think they're going to take me or Deal. And it's more because you definitely have heard of all of our players.
Right.
You know, even Lance Allworth, like he's not quite the hidden name some of these other guys are. I think Deal will take it because people are going to see his old players being Jim Brown and OJ Simpson. And then all four of the other guys, all right, maybe not Dan Marino, but all three of the other guys. Oh, I had him on my fantasy team and he was awesome.
Right.
You know, and then, the guys I didn't own in fantasy because I wasn't alive, like, they're Dan Marino, Jim Brown, and OJ Simpson. Right. That's awesome. Whereas, like, the rest of us, you know, you even joked about it, South, but you're right. Like, to like your team, most NFL fans are going to have to Google Charlie Taylor and Dave Casper.
Right.
Not necessarily because you don't know who they are, but okay, what were their numbers truly like?
Right.
You know, and same thing with Rock for Don Maynard, and to a lesser extent, James Lofton. Like, you might look at James Lofton as part of that Bills Super Bowl run. That wasn't even James Lofton. James Lofton was dominant in the 80s.
Yeah.
You know, he was a shell of himself riding Andre Reed's coattails in the 90s. So, like, to really look at the numbers, I mean, Rock's got a good benefit of LT and Barry Sanders in the backfield, which is pretty awesome.
Yep.
I don't know. It's hard to say.
And honestly, like I said, everybody did their numbers differently. I look at it like I have 1-4 in the back. I have 1-4 of the all-time decades in Tomlinson and Sanders. Brown and Peyton are above Sanders, and so it's LT, Brown, Peyton, and then Sanders. But even if you go with giving me the way I did it and allowing me to bump up their statistics, the difference at wide receiver might be too great to really make up for it. Like I said, it's like a 76 points per season between Gronk and the next best tight end.
Right, but most people don't know that. Like, if you didn't listen tonight and you're just looking at the teams, you're like, all right, well, Rock has the best tight end. But, like, even South and I with Lance Allworth and Charlie Taylor, okay, we have Antonio Brown and Jerry Rice. Right. Like, you have two receivers, people are going to be like, okay, why did he even pick that guy?
I have two receivers that, at best, if you allow me to bump it up to today's NFL standards and a 16-game season, are averaging just over 200 points per season, which would give them a top 10 fantasy season any year, but not.
But they're behind Carter,
Marvin
Harrison,
Rice, Carter,
Brown,
Rice.
They're behind all of our guys. I think Rocco, what this points back to, and again, I'm not picking on you, but it shows our listeners that you do, even in anything, you put yourself at a disadvantage when you try to get that best tight end. And we've been saying it for years, like, if you can get Gronk ahead of us, but then we're going to crush you in other positions.
Yes, but if you and like this is kind of different than regular fantasy, because I would never have taken Gronk that early in a tight end that early in a regular season. And you guys know that. That's the one thing that I don't get cute with, is the tight end position. But in this case, if you really do the numbers and that's what I'm saying, like, if somebody actually took the time and figured out what the averages were for our teams in any format that you're going to do it, then that's fine. Do you get 76 points better than me at wide receiver to make up for Gronk's 76 points?
You're only 2.62 points per game better than me at tight end.
Listen, we all crunch numbers differently for sure. I think ultimately, though, South's question, who are the people going to vote for? No one is going to do the legwork, and I don't blame them. If you put a poll up on Twitter, I'm not clicking on Don Maynard and James Lofton and Frank Tarkenton. I'm clicking on Deal's team because, I've absolutely heard of all 6 of those players as being really good.
Right.
I'm taking Deal's team.
Yeah, look, I think part of me is counting on the fact that when people think about fantasy, they kind of devalue tight end a little bit. So I thought maybe I can kind of toss that one just a little bit if I needed to. People tend to think wide receivers are a dime a dozen. So I'm kind of counting on maybe they'll just look at it and see that I have Jerry Rice and not care who the next guy is. So, I mean, with that in mind, I don't see any way I don't win.
Honestly, South, I think you're hands down the best team in, quarterback, running back, wide receiver. But then you lose it with those other two. Like, it's like your 60s and 70s picks are just not there. Honestly, Drew Brees, Marshall Falk, Emmitt Smith, Jerry Rice. Like, boom. Top top wide receivers decade of all time, top quarterback decade of all time, and 2 of the top 6 running back decades of all time. But then you kind of lose it there.
All right. Well, listen, we're going to turn this thing in. We've had a lot of fun with this. I'm sure the debate is going to rage on social media as we get into the next couple days here, but that's where it's in your hands now. Be sure to get out on social media, vote for the best team, leave us your comments. You could do that at facebook.com/footballgoons, at footballgoons on Twitter, or right here on our YouTube channel. You could let us know, shout it out, who you think had the best team. We've had a lot of fun doing this. We've had a great time getting to 100 episodes. We are looking forward to as many more as we physically can do, to be quite honest with you. And part of what we're looking forward to the most is even more interaction with you as our listeners. So make sure you're hitting us up on social media, engaging with the show. We want to hear from you guys. Each and every week we'll be live right here. You can be a huge part of this show. We'll catch you guys next time.